Hi everyone, the third part in the anatomy of the central nervous system. In this video, we take a look at the brainstem. We will cover the spinal cord and the cerebellum in our next video as an extra video on the neuroanatomy. The brainstem is situated below the level of the diencephalon. When we say brainstem, we mean the midbrain, also called the mesencephalon, pons below the midbrain, medulla oblongata below the pons. Nuclei of the reticular formation, which are responsible for arousal state, as mentioned in the previous video, are scattered throughout the brainstem. Cardiovascular and respiratory centers are found within the pons and the medulla. In this video, we will overlook on these structures. As well, we will not be covering anatomical tracts since it might get hard to understand in this video because of time. Instead, we will explore them in a separate videos in the future. Starting our video on the midbrain, on a lateral view, we can see that the cerebellum is situated behind the brainstem. Cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle and central canal of the spinal cord runs through the brainstem. On a posterior view, below the level of the pineal gland of the diencephalon, situated four bulgings from the midbrain, two upper bulgings and two lower bulgings. The upper two are called the superior, while the lower are called the inferior colliculus, which translates to hills. To better visualize the midbrain, we will make a cross-section at the level of the superior colliculus first. Now for the midbrain, the posterior segment is called the tectum, the middle border is called the tegmentum, while the anterior segment composed of white fibers called the crus cerebri or cerebral peduncles. On the tectum, we find the nuclei of the superior colliculus, and its function is subconscious visual orientation towards the stimuli, like sound for example. On tegmentum, we find the cerebral aqueduct surrounded by gray matter. Anterior to it is the nuclei of the third cranial nerve, the oculomotor nerve, responsible for innervating most of the muscles around the eye and contributing together with the optic nerve in the pupillary light reflex. It leaves the midbrain anteriorly, and its function is the movement of the eye. Then we have the red nucleus, the origin of the rubrospinal tract that contributes to the coordination and fine motor movement of the upper limbs. Then this irregular shaped black nuclei in front of the red nucleus called the substantia nigra. It is functionally connected with the basal ganglia, and it is well known for secreting dopamine as neurotransmitter. Now we are making another section of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculus. Compared to the upper part, the red nucleus is nowhere to be found at the level of the inferior colliculus. On tectum, we find nuclei of the inferior colliculus, which is an additional auditory center. On tegmentum, in front of the aqueduct, is where the fourth cranial nerve, the trochlear cranial nerve, is found, innervating some of the muscles around the eye and responsible for eye movement. Its fibers are leaving backwards and towards the opposite direction. Then they take a rotation, appearing on the lateral part of the midbrain. That's it for the midbrain. Now let's look at the pons. Let's make another cross-section on the pons. Fourth ventricle is found on the posterior part of the pons. Here we have main sensory nuclei of the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve. It is found within the pons, and it's the largest nuclei compared to other cranial nerve nuclei. This nuclei extends upwards and downwards. Mesencephalic sensory trigeminal nuclei is found inside the midbrain. main or chief nuclei inside the pons, and spinal nuclei in the medulla. These nuclei transmits facial and tooth sensation to the brain. Motor nuclei of trigeminal nerve found in the pons near the sensory nuclei, innervating muscles of mastication or chewing. Here we have nuclei of the sixth cranial nerve, the abducens nerve, which supply muscles around the eye and responsible for eye movement, just like the third and the fourth cranial nerves. Motor nuclei of the facial nerve are also found within the pons. They innervate the muscles of facial expression, and that's why it's called the facial nerve. Fibers coming out of facial nuclei rotates around the abducens nuclei before leaving the pons anteriorly. Nuclei contributes to the eighth cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, called the superior vestibular nucleus, are found within the lower part of the pons. On the anterior aspect of the pons, we find the superior olivary nucleus, which is part of the auditory tract. On the frontal surface of the pons, we find pontine nuclei. Fibers of these nuclei are connected to the cerebellum, and they contribute to the coordination of movement. Now we move on into the last piece of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. We will make a cross-section at the pontomedullary junction. Remaining parts of the fourth ventricle is found posteriorly. Anteriorly, the medulla is composed of pyramids, and lateral to the pyramids we find olives. On the posterior part of the medulla, here we find nuclei of the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve, innervating muscles of the tongue and responsible for tongue movement. There is a nuclei for the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, called the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, which mainly supplies the gastrointestinal tract for peristalsis. It's a parasympathetic fibers. Remaining vestibular nuclei are found here, namely medial vestibular nuclei, posterior vestibular nuclei, and inferior vestibular nuclei. With the superior vestibular nuclei on the lower part of the pons, they make up the vestibular nuclei, which is responsible for maintaining balance in the body. Cochlear nuclei are found on the lateral aspect of the medulla, a posterior and anterior nuclei. Fibers from all of these nuclei join together, forming the 8th cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve. These fibers carry on signals to the inner ear, to the cochlear and the semicircular canal, and its function is hearing from the cochlear nuclei and balance from the vestibular nuclei. This would be the sensory spinal nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. In the olives of the medulla, we find an irregular shaped nuclei called the inferior olivary nuclei. This nuclei is connected to the cerebellum, and its function is learning motor patterns. So it's like the memory of the cerebellum. There are dorsal and medial accessory nuclei of the inferior olivary nucleus. So please don't confuse it with the 11th cranial nerve, the accessory nerve. On the anterior aspect of the medullary pyramids, we find the arcuate nucleus, which is connected to the cerebellum for motor coordination, and it's also acts as respiratory center because it contains some chemoreceptors. Here in blue, there is a sensory nuclei which fibers from different cranial nerves crosses by. It's called the nucleus of tractus solitarius. And cranial nerves connected to this nuclei are the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the 9th cranial nerve, and the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. Functions of these nuclei: the 7th cranial nerve carry on fibers of taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, transmitting these fibers to the brain, to the taste area. The glossopharyngeal nerve takes sensory fibers from the posterior third of the tongue. Signals coming to this nuclei from the carotid body and carotid sinus, and these signals coming from baroreceptors and chemoreceptors for estimation of blood pressure and carbon dioxide saturation in the body. Also sensory fibers from the tonsils, the pharynx and the middle ear crosses by through the glossopharyngeal nerve. For the vagus nerve, signals from the thoracic and abdominal cavity, mainly for pain. Signals from the heart, lung and gastrointestinal system, and that's why the vagus nerve is called the wandering nerve. Signals from aortic body and aortic sinuses, just like the glossopharyngeal nerve. Other nuclei connected to many cranial nerves is a motor nuclei called the nucleus ambiguus. The glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and the 11th cranial nerve, the accessory nerve, are connected to this nuclei. Now let's look at the functions of these nuclei. The glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve joins together, innervating muscles of the soft palate, the uvula, pharyngeal and laryngeal muscles, and the upper part of the esophagus. They are responsible together for the gag reflex. The 10th cranial nerve is important for speech through the recurrent laryngeal nerve and for swallowing. It supplies the heart directly to the sinoatrial node, giving a constant impulses to the heart, decreasing the heart rate, something called the vagal tone, and it's important in maintaining heart rate in human being. 11th cranial nerve, the cranial part, which joins with the spinal part of the accessory nerve, and the spinal part originating from different cervical segments in the spinal cord. They innervate muscles in the neck and the upper back, namely the sternocleidomastoid muscle and the trapezius muscle. So that's mainly what we find in the area of the pontomedullary junction at the level of the medulla. Now let's take another cross section, and here we want to see the lower part of the medulla oblongata. Not like the upper part of the medulla, which contains the remaining extension of the fourth ventricle. The lower part of the medulla has the central canal, just like the spinal cord. Now the nuclei are pretty much the same, almost the same nuclei, except for nuclei found in the posterior part of the lower medulla. These nuclei are the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. These nuclei are important in a specific sensory tracts, carrying sensations from all over the body. And we will discuss them when we come to the chapter of the sensory system. Now, on this inferior view of the brain, we want to see all of the cranial nerves. Here is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. This would be the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, at the level of the cerebral cortex. The second cranial nerve, the optic nerve, at the level of the diencephalon. At the level of the midbrain, we find the oculomotor and the trochlear nerve. Then, at the level of the pons, this nerve with three heads is the trigeminal nerve. Anteriorly on the pons, we find the abducens nerve. And within the pontomedullary junction, we find the facial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, and those two nerves joining together, the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve. Then we have this nerve taking part from the medulla, from the lower medulla, and part from the spinal cord, the accessory nerve. And last but not least, the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. So that's it for the third part in the anatomy of the central nervous system. Next video will have a general look into the cerebellum and the spinal cord as an extra video on the anatomy of the nervous system. I would advise you after watching this video to read about the functions of the cranial nerves, specific functions of the cranial nerves, since we didn't cover it in this video. So thanks everyone for watching, and until the next video.